When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Came Mrs. Who's voice. Suddenly, the three of them were there. Mrs. Watsit with her pink stole askew, Mrs. Who with her spectacles gleaming, and Mrs. Witch still little more than a shimmer. Delicate, multicolored butterflies were fluttering about them, as though in greeting. Mrs. Watsit and Mrs. Who began to giggle, and they giggled until it seemed that, whatever their private joke was, they would fall down with the wild fun of it. The shimmering seemed to be laughing too. It became vaguely darker and more solid, and then there appeared a figure in a black robe and a black peaked hat, beady eyes, a beaked nose, and long gray hair. One bony claw clutched a broomstick. "Well, just to keep you girls happy," the strange voice said, and Mrs. Watsit and Mrs. Who fell into each other's arms in gales of laughter. "If you ladies have had your fun, I think you should tell Calvin and Meg a little more about all this," Charles Wallace said coldly. "You scared Meg half out of her wits, whisking her off this way without any warning. Finerexint anime ror aut perpoca loquentis," Mrs. Who intoned. "Horace, to action little, less to words inclined." "Mrs. Who, I wish you'd stop quoting." Charles Wallace sounded very annoyed. Mrs. Watsit adjusted her stole. "But she finds it so difficult to verbalize, Charles dear. It helps her if she can quote instead of working out words of her own." "And we mustn't lose our sense of humor," Mrs. Witch said. "The only way to cope with something deadly serious is to try to treat it a little lightly." "But that's going to be hard for Meg," Mrs. Watsit said. "It's going to be hard for her to realize that we are serious." "What about me?" Calvin asked. "The life of your father isn't at stake," Mrs. Watsit told him. "What about Charles Wallace, then?" Mrs. Watsit's unoiled door hinge voice was warm with affection and pride. "Charles Wallace knows. Charles Wallace knows that it's far more than just the life of his father. Charles Wallace knows what's at stake." "But remember," Mrs. Who said, "Euripides, nothing is hopeless. We must hope for everything." "Where are we now, and how did we get here?" Calvin asked. "Uriel, the third planet of the star Malik in the spiral nebula Messier 101. "This I'm supposed to believe?" Calvin asked indignantly. "As you like," Mrs. Witch said coldly. For some reason, Meg felt that Mrs. Witch, despite her looks and ephemeral broomstick, was someone in whom one could put complete trust. "It doesn't seem any more peculiar than anything else that's happened." "Well then, someone just tell me how we got here." Calvin's voice was still angry and his freckles seemed to stand out on his face. "Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take us years and years to get here." "Oh, we don't travel at the speed of anything," Mrs. Watsit explained earnestly. "We tesser. Or you might say, we wrinkle." "Clear as mud," Calvin said. Tesser? Meg thought. Could that have anything to do with Mother's tesseract? She was about to ask when Mrs. Witch started to speak, and one did not interrupt when Mrs. Witch was speaking. "Mrs. Watsit is young and naive. She keeps thinking she can explain things in words." Mrs. Who said, "Qui placet placete." French, you know. No, I don't know. "The more a man knows, the less he talks." "But she has to use words for Meg and Calvin," Charles reminded Mrs. Who. "If you brought them along, they have a right to know what's going on." Meg went up to Mrs. Witch. In the intensity of her question, she had forgotten all about the tesseract. "Is my father here?" Mrs. Witch shook her head. "Not here, Meg. Let Mrs. Watsit explain. She is young, and the language of words is easier for her than it is for Mrs. Who and me. We stopped here," Mrs. Watsit explained, "more or less to catch our breaths. and to give you a chance to know what you're up against. But what about your father? What about father? Meg asked. Is he all right? For the moment, love, yes. He's one of the reasons we're here. But you see, he's only one. Well, where is he? Please take me to him. We can't. Not yet, Charles said. You have to be patient, Meg. But I'm not patient, Meg cried passionately. I've never been patient. Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. Vitam impender vero, to stake one's life for the truth. That is what we must do. That is what your father is doing. Mrs. Watson nodded, her voice like Mrs. Who's, very serious, very solemn. Then she smiled her radiant smile. Now, why don't you three children wander around and Charles can explain things a little? You're perfectly safe on Ural. That's why we stopped here to rest. But aren't you coming with us? Meg asked fearfully. There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Witch raised her authoritative hand. Show them, she said to Mrs. Whatsit, and at something in her voice Meg felt prickles of apprehension. Now, Mrs. Whatsit asked, her creaky voice rising to a squeak. Whatever it was Mrs. Witch wanted them to see, it was something that made Mrs. Whatsit uncomfortable too. Now, Mrs. Witch said, they may as well know. Should I change? Mrs. Whatsit asked. Better. I hope it won't upset the children too much, Mrs. Whatsit murmured, as though to herself. Should I change too? Mrs. Who asked. Oh, but I've had fun in these clothes, but I'll have to admit Mrs. Whatsit is the best at it. Das Werk lobt den Meister, German. The work proves the craftsman. Shall I transform now too? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not yet. Not here. You may wait. Now don't be frightened, loves, Mrs. Whatsit said. Her plump little body began to shimmer, to quiver, to shift. The wild colors of her clothes became muted, whitened. The pudding bag shape stretched, lengthened, merged. And suddenly, before the children was a creature more beautiful than any Meg had even imagined. And the beauty lay in far more than the outward description. Outwardly, Mrs. Whatsit was surely no longer a Mrs. Whatsit. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time completely unlike a horse. Far from the magnificently modeled back sprang a nobly formed torso, arms, and a head resembling a man's, but a man with a perfection of dignity and virtue. An exaltation of joy such as Meg had never before seen. No, she thought, it's not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. From the shoulders solely a pair of wings unfolded, wings made of rainbows, of light upon water, of poetry. Calvin fell to his knees. No, Mrs. Whatsit said through her voice, which was not Mrs. Whatsit's voice. Not to me, Calvin, never to me. Stand up and carry them, Mrs. Witch commanded. With a gesture both delicate and strong, Mrs. Whatsit knelt in front of the children, stretching her wings wide and holding them steady but quivering. Onto my back now, the new voice said. The children took hesitant steps towards the beautiful creature. But what do we call you now? Calvin asked.